Hi, welcome to this special broadcast of the Federal. The Taliban now claims that more than 85% of Afghanistan is under its control. Even as the US troops start pulling out from Afghanistan, what does it mean for the region? What does it mean for the equation that Taliban is likely to have with countries like Pakistan, India? Also, what will be the future of Afghanistan? But to decipher this and possibly read into the situation there right now, we have a guest with us, Mr. Abdul Basit. He's a research fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, someone who's extensively researched, also written about this region, Afghanistan to be specific. Mr. Basit, welcome to the show.
Glad to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
Well, you've seen what's happened in Afghanistan over the last few weeks and months, especially in the last week or so. Afghanistan, we've seen Taliban taking over large provinces there. Taliban now claims around 85% under their control. How do you see this panning out in the coming weeks and months?
I think this claim of 85% territorial control should be taken with a heavy dose of skepticism. At best, they control 150 districts that are also rural Afghanistan. Remember, in the post-US Afghanistan scenario, the center of gravity of the Afghan war lies in urban landscape. As long as urban Afghanistan is within the control of the Ghani administration, they will retain the control of Afghanistan. There are several districts which the Taliban took were those districts which were abandoned by the Afghan forces to fortify their defense position within the urban areas. While a lot of this territorial control by the Taliban and their claims has generated tremendous propaganda value and publicity for the Taliban within mainstream and social media, the ground reality is a bit different. So, for instance, 14 districts have been retaken from the Taliban also. Now, this is not reported. Also, the fact that they entered one of the provincial capitals, the capital of Baghdi's province, and Afghan forces retook the control of that. So as long as Afghan forces can defend and hold the provincial capitals, major population centers, and cities, I think they will retain the control of the government in Afghanistan. And I think that is an important point to be mentioned in the context of what is going on. The other linked point to this is that while Taliban might be able to overrun a number of districts, but can they hold the territory? And that's a very important question because they just don't have the numbers to hold the territory. So once this counteroffensive starts from the Afghan government to retake the areas. So the first round is when the Taliban have taken some areas. The counteroffensive will be to retake those areas. So when this retake dynamics start, can the Taliban hold their ground? And I doubt they can do that because they are not a conventional military. They don't have that kind of military muscle. They just don't have that numerical strength. So it will be perhaps easier for them to take some areas, but very difficult for them to hold the territory. And I think once that capability will be checked, only then we will be able to see which way Afghanistan is headed. For now, the situation is volatile. For now, the situation is very, very fluid. And I think it generated a lot of Taliban were succeeded or they have been successful in generating this propaganda warfare and media is buying into it. So I think this is where we are. A new power, balance of power is emerging. A new equilibrium is emerging in Afghanistan. Within that context, the US withdrawal context, there is realignment going on within Afghanistan, within the region that is going on. So I think let's wait and see. Let's observe what kind of pattern emerges. And let's hope and pray also that before this, that, this conflict dynamics evolves, some political formula is found between the two sides, Kabul and the Taliban, to do it politically instead of doing it on the battlefield.
True. A political solution is something that many would be hoping for. But how do you look at this reported intelligence data that came in from the US agencies, which said that the Afghan government, Ghani government, would fall within 6 months of the US vacating Afghanistan? Yesterday, Biden has spoken about ensuring that they will help the Afghan government, with whatever it's required. But the fact that on the one hand, you've seen Taliban very strategically target pilots who were trained by the US forces. On the other hand, reports saying that probably the Afghan forces don't have the kind of firearms and the stockpile of it required to fight Taliban. So how do you see this panning out, and what kind of support should the United States and other regional players need to play to ensure that there is a stable government, if not, if a political solution is not possible in the near term?
I think the kind of support that regional countries as well as the international stakeholders, particularly the US, should be providing is the diplomatic support and using that diplomatic influence on both sides to talk to each other. I think that is the most important point in the larger interest of peace as well as of stability. As far as the US intelligence estimates of Ghani government falling within the 6 months, once again, I would say, this situation is very, very fluid, and it will continuously evolve, and all these estimates will evolve accordingly. They will readjust their estimates. Remember, Taliban have only tried taking one provincial capital in the Baghdad province, and within 2 days, they were thrown out of it. So while Afghan forces might done very poorly in the rural side and some districts of these provinces, but within the urban Afghanistan, where I told you the post-US war of Afghanistan, center of gravity lies within the urban Afghanistan. So within 3 to 4 days, they were thrown out of the provincial capital of Baghdad. So if the Afghan government is able to hold the urban landscape or the urban Afghanistan, and they get the support from their international allies, from the regional countries which are pro-Kabul, pro-Afghan, Ashraf Ghani, and they are able to hold the urban Afghanistan against the Taliban, what are you going to have as a result of that in 2 to 3 months down the road? And this is where I said, before things reach that point, some political compromise should be found before that. But if we reach that point, what we will have is an escalatory deadlock. An escalatory deadlock where there will be high casualties on both sides. There will be a lot of bloodshed. There will be a lot of chaos, which will not be in the favor of any regional country. So peace in Afghanistan is in everyone's favor, but chaos in Afghanistan is in no one's favor. So what we are going to have, in my opinion, is an escalatory deadlock. And that escalatory deadlock then will impose a new equilibrium, strategic equilibrium, or new balance of power in Afghanistan. And that new balance of power then will dictate politically which side things will go. Afghan Taliban right now believe they can take Afghanistan militarily. But I think in a couple of months, knowing their limitations, because they are a guerrilla group, they may be masters of hit and run operations, but taking territory and holding a territory is a different ball game. They just don't have that skill set. So they will militarily exhaust themselves in the next couple of months, and then they might realize that a politically negotiated settlement in everyone's favor. Also remember, Taliban have repeatedly said this, despite their ground offensive continuing, that they have no intentions of taking Kabul militarily. In his speech the other day, US President Joe Biden also said that Kabul will not fall to the Taliban. Now, if you look at the repeated iteration of the Taliban of having no intention to take Kabul militarily, and US President confidently saying this means that the secret annex of the US Taliban deal that we haven't seen, maybe there is some understanding between the two sides that there will be no military takeover of Kabul. So that should give us some cause of optimism.
That's a valid point. You're talking about a political formula. And for a political formula to click, equally important is the kind of support that Taliban needs to generate from the region, not just US, but other regional countries as well, or countries in this particular region. So in that context, how do you see the equation between India and Taliban going ahead from here? Because they haven't had a history. They haven't had too much to write about in terms of having any negotiation or any engagement at all. So how do you see the background of this and how it pans out in the coming days and weeks?
So you see, as I told you, all regional countries have reached out to the Taliban. They have opened a channel with them. India is the last one to do it. It was only a matter of when and not if for India, particularly once the US has signed the deal with the Taliban. India would have come to that point. Taliban are the most organized group in Afghanistan. And whatever happens in the future, Taliban will be an important part of the power equation. So having its security interest as well as its investment in Afghanistan, India would like to engage with them, shedding its old rigid foreign policy where the idea was not to talk to such militant groups, because India perhaps thought then the same demand would be there to talk to the Kashmiri groups as well. And I think Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has interacted with the Kashmiri leaders already, anticipating that kind of a pressure or demand from the Kashmiris. Right now, these interactions or back channels between Taliban and India remain exploratory. Both sides are testing waters. They want to see the sincerity of each other. India would like to ascertain Taliban's autonomy, Taliban's neutrality, if not outright autonomy vis-a-vis Pakistan. And if the Taliban can ensure that neutrality to India, I think India would like to continue that engagement. India is also engaging the Taliban via Tehran and via Moscow. You saw that Indian External Affairs Minister was in Tehran, and it is not a coincidence that Taliban and a delegation of Afghanistan were meeting there. And then the same delegation was in Moscow, and Indian External Affairs Minister was also in Moscow. So there is this regional diplomacy going on now. Remember, Russia and Iran alongside India were the three countries which were anti-Taliban in the 1990s, and they used to back the former Northern Alliance group. Now that position has changed, so India is moving back to that regional bloc where they used to once time support the Northern Alliance. Maybe they are now engaging with the Taliban to find a political formula. So I think that is what the Indian position is. And these positions will continue to change as the situation will evolve. So everything that I'm saying right now to you, all the trend lines of the conflict, all the diplomacy, regional diplomacy which is going on, it can change in a matter of days and weeks, given the rapidly evolving situation on ground in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. As you rightly mentioned, it's changing by the hour. You mentioned about Northern Alliance. Before I go to my next question, I just want to ask you, how would you assess Northern Alliance today? Vis-a-vis the 90s, but right now, where do you see their position, the whole scheme of things of, balancing the power equation?
I think this is not the 1990s. Northern Alliance is a formidable group. They have become rich in the last 20 years. They have very sophisticated and modern weaponry on their hands, and they have entrenched themselves for this day. They knew one day the US will leave and they will have to defend themselves. Now, look at all these powerful warlords. Look at Ismail Khan in Herat. He has declared that he will defend his territory. Same goes for Ata Nur Muhammad, Haji Muhakkik, Rashid Dostam's militia, late Ahmad Shah Massoud's son. These are powerful groups. Now, these anti-Taliban militias are powerful, number one. And then you also have, in some areas, civilians self-arming to defend themselves. So I think it hasn't been the Taliban's fighting capability vis-a-vis these militia hasn't been tested yet. We haven't seen those kind of clashes. God forbid, if if we reach that stage, I think it will be difficult for Taliban, because you see, Taliban, what's the power differential here? Afghan National Defense Security Forces are 273,000 to 300,000. Afghan
Yes.
Taliban, as per the UN report, are between 68,000 to 100,000. Now, with 100,000, you can't take 34 provinces. This is impossible. Purely on numbers game, it's not. Now, 273,000 plus you add those anti-Taliban militias to that. So it's purely a semi-conventional muscle we are talking about here. Now, this power differential will keep narrowing as Taliban take more territory, lay their hands on the US weapons, for instance, the Humvees,
Yes.
other weapons, and the surrenders that will take place. And if those forces join Afghan Taliban, their numbers will swell. And it only tells you one thing then. If this happens, that this conflict trend lines tell you one thing. Afghanistan is then headed to a civil war. That is why I'm saying before things reach that point, the regional diplomacy, which is right now going on, is very, very important. And this is where a political compromise should be found. If we reach that point where we want to test how these anti-Taliban militias will do against the Taliban, you will have a civil war. And that's pretty much where they will push back Taliban to their stronghold, traditional stronghold areas of east and south, and north and is where they will entrench. For instance, Ismail Khan is in the western Afghanistan in the Herat, and then you have these Ata Nur Muhammad in Balkh, and then in Panjshir and these areas. This is where Ahmad Masood is. Rashid Dostam's militia is also in Badakhshan, Takhar, these areas. So before we reach there, a political compromise should be found. But if things reach that point, then I think it will be a bit late.
You mentioned about the civil war or the other kind of ramifications that could play out in the coming months. Perhaps the most impact of that would be obviously on the Afghan citizens, but also Pakistan, which is the immediate neighbor. So, how would you see the equation of Taliban and Pakistan going ahead? They've supported Taliban in multiple ways before, but right now, how do you see it back?
Pakistan's influence over the Taliban has gradually weakened and waned. As Taliban gained more territory in Afghanistan, they were less dependent on Pakistan for century. As they became, financially self-sufficient,
Absolutely.
because of various ventures and avenues of funding they have within Afghanistan, also because of diversified diplomatic ties via their Qatar office, their dependence on Pakistan has lessened. So now Pakistan in the current equation and the way rapidly things have evolved is just like another country which can request them but cannot dictate terms to them. Uh, so Pakistani influence will continuously weaken over the Taliban. And about the implication, I think Pakistan will be, after the Afghan civilians, will be the most directly affected country. Now, Pakistani Taliban are ideological twins of the Afghan Taliban. And if they take, God forbid, if they take the government in Afghanistan militarily and reconstitute the so-called Islamic Emirate, then they will inspire similar trends in Pakistan, not just among the Pakistani Taliban. Then you also have these anti-Shia Sunni extremist groups.
Yeah.
You also have Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They will try to replicate the same kind of a model in Pakistan, which means more violence, which means more terrorism, which means more extremism, which means more chaos. And refugees, of course, that goes without saying. Refugees will head towards Pakistan. And in the time of COVID-19, that can mean a new wave of COVID there. And infiltrators can also make into Pakistan. For instance, Pakistani Taliban posing as the Afghan refugees could make it into the Pakistani area. So Pakistan is worried. Pakistan wants to avoid the civil war in Afghanistan and, still look for avenues where political settlement and peace in Afghanistan could be ensured.
Well, finally, Many are saying it's just a matter of time before Taliban takes over Afghanistan. You've said there's a lot more to it. It's not so simplistic. Uh, in terms of a prediction or assessment, do you see that happening in the coming weeks, or at least how much time would you give to the Ghani government, or what would be crucial in the coming weeks?
I think when it comes to Afghanistan, break the crystal ball. Don't even look into it. It is full. I tell you, this is not the 1990s. I will, at the cost of repeating myself, I tell you again, Taliban just don't have the number. They haven't been able to take a single city so far. They moved into Baghdad's provincial capital and they were thrown out within 2-3 days. This is where, again repeating myself, the center of gravity lies. And this is again not the 1990s. Taliban will find it very, very difficult to take Afghanistan militarily. And I think they shouldn't even try. There will be a lot of, civilian losses, innocent lives lost in that. And maybe they will learn it the hard way. But I don't think Taliban can take Kabul militarily. I don't think so. In terms of how long will it take, honestly, I don't know. This is a very, very fluid situation. But what I can predict is in the next 3 to 4 months, we'll have new conflict trend lines. The contours of those conflict trend lines are emerging. Let them mature. Once they mature, only then we will know which way the conflict is now headed. We are entering a new phase of war and a new phase of hostilities. What I can predict for sure is there will be an escalatory deadlock. So I'll leave it at that.
Escalatory deadlock. Also, it might not be as easy as 90s for the Taliban to take over Afghanistan, is the assessment of Mr. Basit. Well, thanks a lot for joining us and also putting this very complex issue in perspective for us. Thank you, Mr. Basit.
Thank you for having me.